Hey everybody, it's Ted here. I'm still working on this 1983 7.5 horse Evinrude. This is the lower unit. This is the one where the vertical drive shaft is frozen in the power head. I'm still attempting to extract it, but in the meantime I figured I'd show my students a little bit about taking lower units apart. So this is a real simplistic early model Evinrude product. It doesn't have any shims in it. Just free floating gears, pretty straightforward. So I asked the students to work on getting the lower water pump housing off, which they successfully did. The bolts have a little bit of corrosion on them, so I showed them the tap method. A little bit of cleaning we gotta do on the threads here, but they did get this piece out. And what I wanted to do was to get that piece out was I could not locate the water pump key, and I wasn't sure where that is. So what I did was I had them pull this off. We rinsed the inside of this out, which exposes the actual passageway in here where a gear lube is that goes down to the pinion gear and ultimately the other gears. After washing it out with parts cleaner and flipping it upside down in the parts cleaner tank, this cylindrical piece of steel falls out. And I'm not sure, but I think it might be the key or a key. I'm not sure how it really got in here, other than what happened was when I pulled the drive shaft out, it stayed and got caught up in the water pump, and it stayed there, and then when the vertical drive shaft came all the way out, that key fell down inside. So the only thing about it is the edges of it are corroded pretty good. It's got a lot of, looks like, corrosion on it. And it does have a flat spot on it, which looks like where it was riding on the vertical drive shaft, the flat area. So the new kit has a plastic flat-sided with a raised ridge to accept the impeller. So it's a half moon piece of plastic instead of this cylindrical round key, which is what I remember. I was gonna go ahead anyway and take the rest of the lower unit apart, show them how to do that, and basically inspect the inside because the age of the engine. So they ended up working on real easy. They got the bolts to come right out. The carrier came out, they took it apart, they cleaned it, and they looked at it, and they said it's all set. So what I wanted to do was, since we're this far into it, we may never get the drive shaft out, but I figured in case you need to reseal one of these old 7.5s, I'd show you how to do it. It's pretty straightforward. You don't need any special tools really. You'll need a drift of some type, maybe a socket to put the seals back in, but I'll show you where they are. So if you do have water in this gear case, you can reseal it. It's not like you have to reshim it or anything like that. So let's get started on showing you how to take the rest of it apart. All right, I've got this just very lightly resting in this vise. It's a soft-faced vise, so I'm not going to damage the lower unit. We've already gotten the bolts out. Now what we ended up doing was taking the bolts, it's a 3/8 socket, tap on a little bit with a hammer and a punch, and they came right loose and they came right out. So these two bolts come out, those out of the way. And then what I did was we took a plastic mallet and we tapped on this and we turned it that direction or the other direction, it doesn't matter. All right, and as we turn this, it sprung up. Now one thing to make note, there is a preload spring for the shift mechanism in here, so you need to be ready. If this spring and this pops loose, the whole shaft and everything will come out of the lower unit. So what you really want to do is you want to have one finger on top of this or have somebody else hold it as you turn it and twist it and pull it out. And then what you'll notice is there is spring tension in here. And when you take this off, if this comes off the prop shaft, inside is going to be the actual reverse gear, okay? And then you have a bushing in here, and that bushing rides on the shaft. So there is no roller bearing in the bottom of this housing. It's just a bushing, it's a brass bushing. So if that comes out, then you should be able to pull the whole shaft out like this, and there's your reverse gear. Your shift mechanism is here, and there's a big spring in here, and that spring holds the preload pin in. So I'm gonna look straight in here at this now just to show you what it looks like. So down inside here is the forward gear. This is the forward gear, here's the pinion gear, and inside there is that pin. And that pin is the shift pin that goes on the mechanism. So if I rotate this, I can hold this. So if I rotate the shaft, that pin is going to fall down in there and get trapped in the shift mechanism. Right, no big deal, we're going to take it out. So I'm going to just open the vise, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over, I'm going to get that pin out. So there's the pin, that's the shift pin. Slide this back in, just ever so slightly touch that on there. So that pin has a pointed end which goes down against the shift mechanism. So the pointed end of the pin goes in. The flat end of the pin goes inside the prop shaft like this. And then that's what moves that shift mechanism into this gear or into the forward gear. Both of the gears are free floating in the housing. So I can reach in here with my finger and I can grab the forward gear and I can turn it. Come on. And I can remove it. So there's the forward gear and there the roller bearing. So you could actually take and get that roller bearing off of the bearing splitter if needed be. I looked at all the gears, they look great. The forward gear especially, no chips, no nothing wrong with that. The pinion gear is also free floating in the housing. So you can reach in there and you can pull that out. Okay, down inside the housing, when I rotate the shift shaft, there's the high side, and that's going to push that pin, and that's going to move that. It's going to move that shifter all the way up into the reverse gear. So this is the reverse position, and then as we go down here, there's a detent. That is the neutral position, and then if you push over that detent, that allows the pin to go all the way down, and that shifts it into forward gear, the forward gear. So it's a very simplistic mechanism. The way I'm going to put it back together is I'm going to put it back together in forward, so the pin goes this far down in the housing. It makes it easy to put this thing together. So here's the top of the shift shaft, and when the shift shaft is facing to the port side, it's flat. And then if I rotate it back the other way and it faces straight, flat faces straight up, that is the reverse position. So if you did pull this out by accident, you have to take that all apart because the shift mechanism is going to fall in the housing. And what you got to do is take the forward gear out, take the pinion gear out because it'll fall out, no big deal. And then what you can do is take that shift mechanism out, and it actually, that mechanism, it's on the end of the shaft. It fits just like this. It's flat, and it only goes on one way. Really nice back then what they did, that shift mechanism is one side of it says up. It actually says up. So that shift mechanism with its kind of cantilevered look has up on one side of it. So if you did pull this out, it's not the end of the world. The taller end of the flat goes into the power head shifter. The short end goes into the lower unit. And when you put it back together, just remember that this flat area, if it faces up towards you, that's how it gets reinstalled. And then you line it up. That way you'll know it does not face down, because if I rotate it all the way the other direction, I can't rotate it down. And if I go this way, that's as far as it goes. So flat side faces aft towards the back side of the housing. If you do remove this, you have to take it apart. It's not the end of the world. Again, when I'm going to put it back together, I'm going to turn this 90 degrees. Okay. There are two back-to-back seals in here that need to be replaced. If you take it apart, you could reseal that. We still have to clean this gasket off. There are two seals in the lower unit here. These are the prop shaft seals, and those can be replaced. All right, you just take a drift or a screwdriver and pry the first one out. And then what I would try to do is I try to get in here with a small thin screwdriver and drive the other one out. And then you're going to need a suitable socket mandrel to press these seals back in with a press. I would not beat them in with a hammer. All right, and that would be where the seal lips, one seal lip faces in, one seal lip should face out. So this seal lip faces out, the sharp end faces out, and then the other seal faces in. All right, so let's go ahead and put it back together again. All right, in reverse, if you were going to put it back together again, shift mechanism piece goes in, faces up, faces this direction. Put your shift shaft in, line it up, only goes one way. Again, remember the flat side, the short flat side goes down into the shift mechanism. The longer flat side faces into the power head. That's what goes into the shifter. If you would remove the pinion gear, it simply slides back in there. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take that forward gear, all right? And that forward gear has to have the actual shaft go through it when you put it back together, and I'll show you that. So here's where the seals ride, and we're gonna clean the shaft up just a little bit before we put it back together, and I'll show you that after we clean them up. All right, we're getting ready to put it back together, and what I've done is I've cleaned up the prop shaft some with a little bit of crocus cloth and then some 1500 grit sandpaper, and there's some pits in here. It's not a perfect prop shaft, but for 1983, I think it's gonna survive probably another 10 years. So we're gonna put it back together with the forward gear, all right, and the forward gear facing down. The reverse gear faces towards it, so we have to put that back in last. So I'm gonna take the lower unit, reclamp it so that the prop shaft's horizontal so this pin won't fall out when I put it back in. So let me get that set up. All right, when you do stand it up, you'll see that that pinion gear is gonna fall out, and there is a thrust washer that just fell out. Let me grab that. And there's the thrust washer, and you'll be able to see the polished side that has the actual bearing surface on it, and then you have a shiny side. So you'll know right away which side goes on the bearing, and that is the polished side. So the polished side is what faces the bearing if you lose it. Right, so that just slides up into the housing, and there's a roller bearing that's pressed in the housing that rides on this. And that roller bearing looks all right. The little black coloring is just discoloration from gear lube that's old. Nothing to be concerned of. Okay, with the housing all cleaned out, we're gonna take the pinion gear, and as I showed you before, the polished side of the thrust surface. So we gotta put the pinion gear in first, so that has to fit in the housing first. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hold this and just a little bit negative vertical in the vise, just a touch. And that allows me to take the forward gear and put that in behind the pinion gear as such. Just lay that down in there. And then you can use your finger to pick it up a little bit and get it into its position on its race. There we go. So they're both in there now, and you can hear them spin just fine. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put it vertical, stand it upright the standard way it is, and clamp it back in the vise, maybe with a little view here so you guys can see how this goes back together. And I don't have my little stand out, so I'm just using the soft vise to hold it. Okay, so we've got the prop shaft here, and we have the forward gears further in. This is gonna go into that prop shaft and fit it, all right? And you have the shift points here. It doesn't matter which way you put it in there. The recess is the same, and these dimensions are the same. Now, when you have the reverse gear is the one that's after that. That's gonna go over the shaft like this. And then that reverse gear fits in here, okay? Now that reverse gear will not be engaged until this is all put back together, and then when this pin is compressed, it will drive that in and engage that reverse gear in position, okay? So once this is all put together, you put a little oil on it, okay? And then what we can do is we can slide that in the housing as such. And a little oil, and there it is. Now, if I take that shaft and I rotate that shift shaft, okay, then that pin is going to be driven in or out. So if I rotated the prop shaft, so what I did before, as I told you, is to make sure that that shift mechanism in there is on the recess side, and that would be that the top of the shift shaft is the flat side faces to the port 90 degrees, so the flat is facing the port side of the top of the shaft. So if we slide this back in here, we're all set. Now we can put the actual retainer back in. So new O-ring, some grease on it, seals, and what you can do is simply slide this into position over the prop shaft, get it started, and then you can turn it and put it in position with the bolts. And then at that point, it should pop all the way in. And that is because that shifter is all the way, allowing that pin and the spring tension to go on it. So at that point, put the bolts in there. These essentially, I think, are 1/4 bolts from the age of it. Just remember that if you do remove this from the top and it does come out and the shifter comes out, when you put it back together, the short end of the shift shaft goes into the shift mechanism, the one that's got that weird cantilever look to it. Short end goes down and it's marked up. That cantilever piece is marked up. You can't put it in there wrong. And then when you put it back together, make sure the flat side of the top of the shift shaft faces to the port, and that'll let that pin go into its deepest position, which would be the forward position. So that will lock the shifter into forward. So if you had a vertical drive shaft in there, which you can remove because it just splines into the pinion gear, then you could spin it and the prop shaft would turn clockwise at that point. All right, so I'm just gonna torque the bolts and then we'll get the gasket kit and finish putting this, change this gasket with the students and the seals in this, and then put that back together. And these bolts look as if they are the same as these. And yes, they are the same. So the water pump base screws, bolts are going to be the same torque as these. These are a little shorter, but it'll be the same torque as this. These have brass inserts in the plastic. So what's different about this is there are brass inserts or bronze inserts. They could be stainless, and they're also, I believe, on the bolts. Yes, there are inserts in here, so you will not crush the plastic when you put this back together and you torque it. So I looked in a Evinrude book, and the torque spec for the carrier is for 1/4 bolts like these is 60 inch-pounds or 5 foot-pounds. So we're going to torque these down lightly, bring them down evenly so you get the housing straight until it gets semi-tight. And there's 5, and there's 5, and that's it. So that's 60 inch-pounds. Same thing in the upper portion. I'm going to tighten those top bolts when I put that lower water pump base on there to 60 inch-pounds too. Okay, so this is the second part of working on this 1983 Evinrude 7.5. This is just kind of a fun thing to do with students to show them how this works. It's an awesome small lower unit to show them how shift works. Every shift mechanism is a little different. There's always back-to-back seals in the carrier. There's always back-to-back seals up here on the water pump that need to be changed when you reseal it. There's an O-ring on the carrier that needs to be changed when you reseal it. And there's a base gasket on the water pump base. So if you ordered a lower unit seal kit and you wanted to take this apart and change the seals in it, you'll have to use a couple of sockets to press them back in. But you want to use a press. Try not to get in the habit of using a hammer and beating on things. That's just, seals don't go in straight. You'll probably have problems with it. So if you like the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.